Hi, my name is Gia Hamilton, and thank you for joining me for Live Your Purpose Artfully, a video series that looks at creatives and innovators who are living, working, and visiting the city of New Orleans.
I think I was still a very solitary Sagittarian child in a lot of ways. Was definitely into puzzles, had a lot of Legos, was interested in how things are made to some degree. My mom studied to be an artist, never actually worked as an artist in a lot of ways, but studied mostly sculpture and painting. So as a child, I remember painting with her as a very fond memory as a child, and thinking about just having these different outlets for wonder and creativity and exploration to be there. And it was always a kind of coveted thing because her time was limited. So when we could do that, it was a really special thing. And then that just kind of carried over. So I was a kid that was always drawing constantly, mostly because I was deeply socially awkward and very silent as a child, not very verbal. So I was always in my own world in a notebook drawing somewhere. Or building something in my room, and then later that extended to playing music, or extended to I don't know. I can remember being in early arts camps and actually taking apart computers and playing with the parts to just make little sculptures that didn't work or do anything and purely aesthetic. But a lot of those memories of just exploration as a child, I felt really fortunate for that. Although I think attention was limited in my home, it created a lot of time to just try things out.
Yeah.
And I think to develop those skills of both seeking things out and then just being immersed in it and kind of reveling in it.
Yeah. So you're taking things apart. You're making things.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking about just how things are put together. And when I think about your current work, or at least some of the projects that you've worked on, that still plays out in the work that you're making. What was that trajectory or that path? Did you deviate from that and take other courses in terms of interest? Or do you feel like that's been pretty consistent in your creative practice?
I think almost everything dropped off for me as soon as I entered into high school.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those really interests really went to the wayside. I was really advocating to go to this particular high school in Chicago. It's called St. Ignatius College Prep. You can imagine with that name what it was.
Yes, this is interesting.
Yeah, but I advocated to go there because essentially the public high schools in my area were not particularly great. The other option was to be in a single-sex parochial school, and I certainly didn't want to do that. And so within my limited knowledge of the city, Ignatius was the place where the smart kids went, and where there's at least maybe more of an expand to test or get interested in the intellect that I knew I wouldn't be able to find in those other places, and also didn't want to be in a culture of 14 to 18-year-old boys. That was not a place where I wanted to be. So I was very much advocating to go to that high school, and I think one of the drawbacks of going there was that it is a very normative space with a lot of very privileged kids there.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first moment when things that I'd experienced as a child previously that were interpersonally oppressive, I could now see on a much larger scale. Right? It was all of those kids cheated as well, but they didn't get kicked out. But the people that I knew got kicked out for these minor things. Or seeing how the deans of the high school would interact with certain students, and knowing just how much of a cash flow was going into that place, and then going to those people's homes and seeing really opulent wealth that I had never really encountered before. So I think in high school there was a lot of internal friction and contradiction around seeing those things that were interpersonal not as a series of events, but really understanding them as a long continuum of things and at a much larger scale than I was used to. So in high school I was really antagonistic to basically everything.
That sounds similar to me. Yes.
Yeah, and it took a while I think to really mature that, because at the same time, and similar to today, I was just an odd pairing of different things. I was a really good athlete. part of the reason that I went there is like kind of getting a scholarship to play basketball. So like their coach came to my 8th grade games to like see me play.
I played basketball. What position did you play?
I mean, I played center, but only because at the time I was just taller than everyone else.
Yeah.
And my dad was also like a really like prominent athlete. He was like one of the like top ranked players in Chicago at the time.
Wow.
And went on to play basketball in college. And so from an early age, we were also kind of like drilled to do that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so a lot of those early explorations dropped off because I think I didn't have the language to articulate like any of those realizations around like what political economies and landscapes actually look like, particularly in Chicago. And so there's a deep sense of frustration and anger and not having any kind of like dialogue to, one, like explain how I felt, let alone like articulate or describe what was happening. So that need had been there from like that kind of age. And then I think the thing that really expanded again, this interest in taking things apart, understanding how the pieces fit together, like practices of deconstruction didn't happen until maybe sophomore year of college.
Yeah.
And so my freshman year, you had to take these kind of mandatory rhetoric classes.
Yeah.
And I would just write these scathing essays about how I hated all of the like straight cis dudes on campus, more or less. And my teacher was like, you should consider taking a gender studies class. And then that's what sort of started that sort of like reignition of like interest and like engagement in the world again. But then also practicing this like more conceptual ways of like deconstructing something, understanding things as a kind of genealogy rather than as a given. So like historic genealogies were really interesting to me. Like, where did the concept of nationalism come from? How was gender like built to be something that was binary? Or how were like designations of race like held to be fixed rather than these just sort of like fluid things that they kind of are? But understanding, I think, how power and discourse were able to identify and sediment something as like a known fact was super interesting to me. And knowing that that's not like an actual truth, right? There's a history to that kind of construction.
So I know that, you know, research and field work is a big part of your practice. Who were you reading then and who are you reading now? Like, what was informing some of this work?
I think the first like kind of genealogy that I really read that really stuck with me in terms of like, oh, okay, that's not just like a thing. It's not like a naturally occurring thing. I read Imagined Communities, that Benedict Anderson book. It was like, oh, this is an ambitious project. You're trying to show how nationalism came to be a kind of like functioning concept as a way to like govern and organize people. And so I think that book opened up a whole lot. And then there's just some really, like, all the kind of formative Black feminist epistemology was really crucial in thinking about that in a much more interpersonal way. And I think having a lot of, like, grace and love that was there, that was hard to find when reading a lot of, like, second wave white feminists for the most part, or a lot of kind of, like, lesbian separatists at the time. And so, I mean, Kambahi's statement was really crucial in thinking about a lot of those things. Kambahi still sticks with me, I think, as a really crucial, not only like epistemology or way of knowing the world, but way of like working and moving through the world as well, right? And so that kind of like mutual constitution of race and gender, and understanding that lived personal experience is the kind of gateway, not for becoming sectarian identities, but for understanding what are the commonalities kind of across difference. Like difference is the generative bridging tool rather than like trying to homogenize everything or saying everything is like heterotropic and has no like form of interaction. So those things were really crucial. A lot of June Jordan's poetry was really crucial and still continues to be. I think that kind of like elegance was something that I was really drawn to. And I still think continues to like inform how I think about presenting something visually. Of having something that can be seemingly delicate, but then really actually demonstrate the violence that's there. And I think that's kind of where my work is now, right? That's why I like maps. It's why I like want to dig into data, these things that are seemingly innocuous or don't have like an inherent, we don't think of them as having like a sort of inherent political designation, but to really break apart the kind of embedded arguments, the embedded histories, the embedded sort of like assumptions and like historic ways of like seeing the world in very fixed ways are all embedded in those things. So breaking them apart, looking at them in different kind of intersections or iterations, and then trying to make different arguments through the same medium is really exciting to me.
And so in terms of your own studies, like, you know, what do you feel like are your tools for doing this work?
That's a good question. I think it's been a kind of like amalgamation of a lot of different things. I've not had a very clear path for it. So while still an undergrad, so I started studying chemistry when I went to college, and then dropped that, I guess, around like sophomore, junior year. And then I was doing psychology and chemistry at the same time. I really wanted to be a psychiatrist when I first went to college. Yeah. And then picked up gender studies, and then had this kind of pairing of gender studies and psychology. So I was doing a lot of work in mostly like recovery centers or like homes for people that were like leaving situations of intimate partner violence. And so then continued that work here in New Orleans at Hagar's house.
Yeah.
And so I think the first ways that I started thinking about the effect or what design could offer to that space, which I hadn't really considered until we were running these workshops around political education. And in a lot of ways, it was a big like failure to some degree. Like, you know, I had like read all this stuff and it's like, we're going to have readings and we're going to discuss this with residents and blah, blah, blah. And of course, like none of them were really accessible. They all had like language that like is sometimes really helpful to know, but is hard to like create entry points to understanding. So we kind of scrapped that and then started from personal narratives. And so I would have just like story circles and have people like share stories around some theme and then just like map out some of the words that were there. So we could at least start to see commonalities and then use that as a way to have more of an analysis around like post-Katrina housing situations, right? So that we at least have something that we can all look at rather than it becoming like this kind of divisive thing or thinking of our stories as being unrelatable to anyone else.
Do you ever think about stories as these kind of maps of larger kind of histories and genealogies in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, like, through our lived experience, we absorb all of that. So stories can be a really kind of like deceptively, I think, acute and complex way of understanding those histories. I mean, that's all history is. It's just like the vantage point from which the speaker is seeing that. So I think the more that those stories can overlap and we can kind of thread them together or see where they meet, it's super informative in thinking about histories and context. And often the histories that, again, are not like within the canon or do not have the kind of like external legitimacy that, you know, like mostly white concrete historians have been given.
Yeah. You're bringing together design, the contemporary discourse, architecture to some degree that I see in a lot of the work, tech, gender, identity. How did you formulate this kind of combination of areas of study? What does that look like for people, especially who, are given kind of trajectories or paths? I think it's always just really important to hear how different creatives and artists are building upon their knowledge base to situate themselves.
I mean, I think it's one of those things where when you're in it, you have no idea, and it's really deeply terrifying, but you feel compelled to do something, and so you just kind of have to trust that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's really just been a continuation of these different like pursuits. So again, like after Hagar's house, when thinking about, someone will consider what I did in this instance design, then that word like came into my vocabulary in a way that it had never been before, right? I had never considered or knew anything about design, or if I did, I would associate it with like maybe fashion design. Yeah. That's like the closest thing I could like conceptualize. And at the time I was living with Lane, and Lane was like, I think Lane had showed me something from the Center for Urban Pedagogy. Yeah. And it happened to be the poster that Candy Chang had designed. And at the time, Candy Chang's email, I think, was still on her website. So I just sent her an email. I was like, this is what I'm doing. Can we like meet up and have coffee? And we did. And then I ended up working in her studio, Civic Center, with James Reeves for like a year and a half. And so starting to develop some of those more formal skills around design, or at least how to conceptualize or think of what that process is. And then continue to do that with the Fair Housing Action Center in terms of like designing some of their outreach materials. And so that's, I think, really where, you know, this very like gendered understanding for how people don't have access to housing or what that looks like. Thinking about cities and city space, and also like planning in a way came from that early work with Hagar's house. And then the design element was like, oh, this is a way to like maybe articulate that in some way. And so it's trying to harness all of those things together. And I think having trouble finding that here, or finding like the like discursive home for that. And so that's why I left to go to grad school. I did this program at Parsons that is at least pretty experimental in like making home for those things. And then maybe because it is so experimental, doesn't always have the acuity that I think is helpful in like formalizing your practice, which takes patience and time and just like trying a lot of things. So it was great for that. But I wouldn't say that I came out of that program being like, this is my practice, this is what I'm doing.
Right.
But I did learn like more formal skills, right? That's the first place where I made my first map, or started to work with like geospatial data, or had an awareness around how to do like pretty investigative like site-based research, and how to look at things from different sources. So to do a kind of political analysis, to do an economic analysis, to look at the actual geology of the space, and then to look at like social dynamics and think about how those things do land, like how do they come together, how can we kind of get to some of the like essential things that we can understand about this place. Yeah.
So, okay, can you describe your first map? What were you thinking about? What is it of? What are you, what things are you bridging together?
So the first map that I made is the map that turned into the project called Retune. So this is where the whole interest in redlining came from. So this was like 2013, 2014. And at the time, I think I'd already knew about redlining and already seen the redlining maps. And to be honest, like my first draws are they're really beautiful maps. Like aesthetically, they're really captivating. And so was really interested again in this notion of like this beautiful aesthetic thing that kind of like elides the violence that's inherent within it. And my question was always like, well, we understand like the kind of history of redlining, at least like in the kind of formal history, we understand it ending in 1968, right? As like a formal practice, but obviously it still continued in so many ways. And so I wanted to understand like what is the effect of redlining today? And I was also reading this book called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor by someone named Rob Nixon. And so he kind of coins this term slow violence, which, you know, has kind of been in the discourse for a little while. Like Rachel Carlson's work obviously kind of talks about slow violence. I don't know if she calls it that, but he's obviously like borrowing from her in a lot of ways. And I was interested in this notion of violence that you don't see, that's like attritional, that is like usually beneath the ground, like subterranean in some way, until it kind of like erupts into these like constantly destabilizing presence, right? So I really wanted to play with time, play with this notion of like stretching or elongating those geographies to our contemporary moment. And so I was finding scans of the redlining maps, like tracing the different like redlined, tracing all of the class areas. So both like class 4, the redlined areas, and then also class 1, the areas where like loans were given out. And then wanted to put them onto contemporary space and then look at data from today through those lenses. So that was the first map that I made. And then really turned into the redlining project, which is around, looking at different data sets from today, but like through those geographies to see how lasting that imprint is, right? Decisions that were made in the 1930s that were like explicitly racist, explicitly sort of systemic in their application. Because again, we're talking about 248 cities that went through this process. And so really wanted to understand, how we can see both the effects of that today, how we can understand it as like a kind of visuality of slow violence, because that's the thing, it's often really hard to see or to like encapsulate in any way. And then to really use that as a way to think about how race and space become like really fixed. Become really fixed again in the 1930s, but still having an effect in like 2014.
So, you know, I'm always, because I've had the pleasure of being in your studio, and I was really struck by just the range of materials that you work with. everything from what feels like the kind of organic to, again, what also feels like these more ephemeral data-based materials. How are you thinking about, choosing materials and things to work with to create this kind of visual language?
I think they're kind of like two things that happen at the same time. I think one is that I never went through any really formal art training, right? I don't have a BFA, I don't have an MFA. And so when it comes to materials, there's just a lot of exploration. Most of my process has been very design based, and then making some kind of artistic argument through the designed form. So when you see those stereoscopic maps that I've been making, right? To me, it's oh, that's the design form, and then I'm not quite sure what the material needs to be. Sometimes it's dependent on the space that it's going to be shown in, or trying to experiment with different ways to come into the map. So that's why some of the fabric stuff is there, and thinking about how to create screens essentially.
Yeah.
So you can physically walk through the layers and understand that maps are just made from these layers.
Yeah.
Right? So it's all really dependent on the argument that I'm trying to make. And then the sort of other direction, which is all the newsprint stuff right now, which I also consider data in a lot of ways. I consider even textiles definitely is the first form of data. There's a whole very unique history on the jacquard loom and the ways in which data is inscribed into something, and the process of encoding, that all comes from weaving basically. We wouldn't really have modern computer science without any of that stuff. And so that very much comes from the concept that I was playing with, which is around the freedom quilts and around how we inscribe cultural knowledge into a kind of medium. So again, coming up with different symbols to inscribe meaning, to communicate to slaves on the Underground Railroad around what this house is, if you should take cover, if this is a safe place, if you need to be aware of patrolling slave catchers in the area, and thinking about that as a form of protection. And I think this is a consistent thing within my larger interest of how Black people actually protect themselves moving across spaces that they're not meant to, right? And to think of race and space as things that are much more fluid than they are in these kind of fixed designations.
Yeah.
And so that continued into doing a little bit more research again around the printed word and newsprint in particular, remembering how a lot of the homes here are actually insulated with newspaper, or were insulated with newspaper at some point. And that dates back to this West African tradition of trying to protect your home from evil spirits, because the written or printed word was held to be sacred. So if you make strips of those newspaper where you can't clearly read from left to right, then the spirit has to try and decode the newsprint before they can enter, right? So trying to pair both the symbols from the freedom quilts, but within the materiality of the layered newsprint, to think about how to put these different diasporic practices of self-protection kind of on top of each other, which also just I think is necessary today, just when thinking about how to protect yourself from the inundation of news media, or the inundation of having a resolved sense of self while there's so much that's in motion around you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about how data is just literally kind of all around us all the time, right? And that we can have a kind of concrete experience with it, but that we're now having to contend with it just being a regular part of our existence and how we walk in the world. When I hear you speak, especially about just the tools, the way that you think about materials and trying to communicate and make this argument, I think about Shirin Nishat's work and the fact that she's an Iranian artist who is actually in exile, and she's done a lot of media-based work. And something that was really compelling to me was that she'd done this entire series called A World Without Men. And it was video-based and photography-based installation work. And she shared that she had never used a camera before. It was her first time, right, using a camera. And she talked about the fact that she didn't need to before. That all of her other work, the tools came to her and spoke to her. And so I thought really specifically about, it seems like you're thinking about really broader subject matter in some ways there's this personal experience, right, that kind of like macro to micro and what is happening in between, and that through your research these different tools and materials come up that you then explore. And so as you're just thinking about your journey and you're thinking about kind of like what's next, what are some of the things that you're interested in, that you're like, that you're feeling drawn to or magnetized by?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, if I'm being really honest about like my work and its limitations, I think the thing that is missing is more of the personal connection or like the personal narrative, either like from myself, but mostly from the kind of like arguments or subject matter that I'm trying to represent, right? So much of it is around trying to represent something in a kind of systemic way. And then not only to represent that, it's more like making that visible, again, within the form that we often don't see, and then trying to reinsert like a different lens into that, right? So the decoding possibilities, the like stereoscopic maps, it's all about like actually removing the ways that we talk about redlining, right? The redlining shapes like make the map like illegible. Until they're able to kind of like look past those narratives and then see this much more fluid way that the Combahee was operating at the time in Boston. And I still feel really drawn to that because that's naturally, I think, how I think or like look at the world. It is a little bit like larger and analytical because I'm way more protective around like the self and like putting that out there. And so I think what is engaging or exciting to me is having those two things meet much more, and to really get to, I think, a different articulation or maybe valuation of lived experience, of like personal epistemology, to be like a viable way of like contending with the very like positivist, fixed, large aggregated data ways in which like the world is being informed by it. Right? And those models are very much being like, and we know that this is not true, but they are very much being promoted as being infallible. They're promoted as being these large managerial tools that are free of bias, that are very efficient. And we all know that the world is far more complex than that. So I think the most exciting thing for me right now, at least conceptually, is not only to point out the limits of those arguments, but I think to really find this overlap between historic, like personally and subjectively situated, and like lived and effused epistemologies to create a whole lot of layers like on top and beneath what we think of as like, again, these like large kind of algorithmic decision-making processes. And I think in ways that are better able to show the complexity of the world, and then to like let machines do what they do well, which is like to look for patterns based on what you give it. And if what you're giving it is inherently limited, it's going to give you inherently limited outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
And so
bad data in, bad data out.
And so I think that's really exciting to me. And also the potential of things that are just like unknowable or unassimilable, right? Like I'm interested in data that can't be universalized, that is just like place-based and situated. Like the knowledge that we have like took place in the workshop and then people left. It's not on our site, like the narratives of what people said isn't like being promoted as like a campaign. It's like we had that experience, that was our way of circulating knowledge and information, and then it goes on. And so conceptually, I think those are the things that are really interesting. And then I think just building up more of a practice around like the techniques and the technical applications that are able to communicate those things. I think if anything, I sometimes feel really limited in what materials would actually like demonstrate the idea. And I think this is why new media is particularly interesting in that way, because things can be layered so well. Things can have so many inputs that can be performative, that can be representative, but that can also literally give us like a lens over the contemporary world that we look through, right? So I think that's why this next 5 years will be like a kind of deep process into building up those more technical ways of trying to explain and play with a lot of the conceptual ideas that are there. But I very much see it as like a battle for like knowledge and authority right now.
So speaking of knowledge and authority, you know, you're teaching. I want you to talk about that experience and then a transition back into kind of deep learning mode that I think you're going to be in really soon.
Yeah. So teaching is really difficult. I think it's really difficult to do it well.
Yeah.
It's something I really love, and I was, I think, surprised by how much I actually really like it.
Yeah.
I think it was something that I thought I could do or would be good at. And I think it takes just a ton of practice and a ton of like improv. Like, I think the best classes I've had have been when like, oh, none of that worked. And so we have to like actually stop and pause, like throw all the lesson plan out the window and then really try to engage with like what is informing like how people either are or are not understanding what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And then to work from what they do know, like works really well. Like we do a lot of story circles in my class.
Wow.
I try to, because I teach, or I was teaching 3 classes this past semester. We met once a week, so you have to really work to retain consistency from week to week. And they're 2-hour and 40-minute classes, so you have to like fill the time, but not put too much in, and leave time that's a little unstructured. And I would always begin the class at least with some kind of game or activity, something silly, but that like speaks to some of the concepts that we're going to be teasing out later.
This is fascinating about you. Maybe I'm like, I want to hear about these games and silly things that you
like I always have students do blind contour drawings the first day of class of each other, like portraits. Mostly because it like breaks down the like fear of talking to someone else, because you just have to awkwardly look at them for a few minutes and then draw, and no one feels comfortable with what they drew. But it's a way to talk about like training the eye to see things differently. It's about knowing the context in which you're drawing, right? Because you're not aware where like the end of the page is necessarily. So how to have like a situational sort of like understanding of context when we are doing research in the world or when we are creating something. Things like that. I have students do like paper airplane throwing contests when we talk about like prototyping and iterations. It's just a way for them to all have some attached entry point to then what we're going to discuss in maybe more of an abstract way later on in the class period. Yeah.
So you're making a transition and into having more time and space.
Mm-hmm.
If you thought about just having abundant resources in the way that I think we know the universe operates, what would you be working on? What would you be making? What would be important to you in terms of how you spend your time and energy?
I think at this point it wouldn't be around making artwork, to be honest. I have like a kind of fleeting fantasy, I think, of winning a MacArthur Genius Grant and getting the $500,000 to do whatever I want with it.
I can see this. I can see this happening.
Mostly I want that because I really feel a kind of dire need to have a different model of like living and producing in the world.
Yeah.
And I'm someone who I think has a hard time conceiving of, I don't know, having a partner and owning a home together. Like those are things that I think actually feel pretty uncomfortable to me. What feels a lot more salient is a kind of cooperative living situation where we have a producing space, where we make decisions about like what we want to do to have money to then fund all the other things. A friend and I have been talking about like owning a factory for a few years now. I think if I had unlimited funds, it would really be around putting them towards the infrastructure to, I think, have the kinds of production, have the leniency or the freedom around time and space to then have people do whatever they want, whether that is like an educational pursuit, whether it is artistic production, having that kind of like early space for exploration. Like I just always want to have the means to do that and the means to offer that to other people. And I also think that's where the overlap of like critical insight and discourse comes from, right? It certainly doesn't come from people sitting in rooms reading books, right? Like that is a part of the process, but then it's about the dialogue. It's about like throwing that around and seeing where its limits are, seeing where it's blind to something. And so I want to have that kind of constantly generative space, both intellectually and then like artistically and creatively.
And that's here in the States? Like, fingers crossed. Or where would you be?
I don't know. This is where, like, of course, it's like very immaterial for me. It's like, it's similar. It's like the concept's there. I don't know what the material is for it yet. I don't know where it lands, but I think ideally it would be a network of things across different places.
Yeah.
I think very simply, and one of the ideas that, again, a close friend and I have been talking about is just having like a convening of people that we think are all thinking, talking about, or like in some similarity on that. And mostly just like kind of starting it from there. I think really slowly, having like kind of a summer retreat. I think this is why a lot of Alexis Pauline Gunn's practice is particularly interesting, and all of like the kind of like all of the brilliant sort of like summer camp things are just great ways to convene and then allow the effects of that to ripple out and then like come back and kind of assess or come back and see what happens. So I think if I were given unlimited resources and time, it would be much more on building those kinds of infrastructures than, I don't know, like making some new series of pieces or work.
Yeah.
Because ultimately that actually feeds me a lot more. And all the work is really just trying to like encapsulate like one of those moments.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing and spending time with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.